we are actually lucky to have Professor Carlson with us. This is not the first time at Qahwa University. Hazem Azmy and my colleague Lobna Ismail, who will be with us in 5 minutes. So I thought we'd better get started. Of course, we all know Professor Marvin Carlson. His talk is about an overview of theater in the revolution. And of course, he is professor. Professor Marvin Carlson was our keynote speaker here in 2008 Symposium. He is Distinguished Professor of Theater and Comparative Literature at the Graduate Center, Columbia? City University of New York. He is a specialist in drama, member of many theater associations around the world, and has participated in judging several competitions at theater festivals. He published numerous volumes on theater, including The Theater of the French Revolution, the German stage in the 19th century, the Italian stage from Goldoni to the Anuncium, and Theories of the Theater, which appeared in 8 languages apart from English from 1984 to 2007, and many more important volumes. I was personally inspired by Professor Carlson's writings and his semiotic analysis, which inspired me to really understand what the dramatic experience is all about. Hazem Azmi, El-Tunsi, is co-convener of Arabic Theatre Working Group, the International Federation for Theatre Research. Of course. And he's going to talk about speaking something to power, revisiting Qahwa, Sada, which is dark coffee. And Lobna Ismail, when she comes, I'm going to introduce her. So, Professor Carlson, please welcome with me Professor Marvin.
First of all, of course, I must say what an enormous pleasure it is to be again with all my friends in Cairo. It's always a delight to come back here and meet many new, interesting people every time I come. I am so grateful to be able to participate again in this wonderful conference, which has given me much pleasure and has contributed a great deal to international understanding of the theater. So both generally and specifically to my many dear friends in the room, thank you so much, Shukran. I'm delighted to be with you again. I'm going to be speaking today on theater, performance, and revolution. This is Lobna, our third panelist. Performance studies has called attention to the central role played by repetition in all human cultural activity. The dynamics of such activity, although each articulated activity bears the unique mark of its particular moment in time, also carries within each one the ghosts and echoes of previous activities, which exert a strong influence, acknowledged or unacknowledged, on how new events unfold and are experienced and understood. This is as true of simple and everyday events as social interaction on the streets as it is of large and complex events such as revolutions, the subject of the current conference. Although the concept of an originary shaping performance is denied by most modern performance theorists, many highly visible and complex clusters of human activity look back to a model example, even if this example has been somewhat changed by mythology. Such is certainly the case of the revolutions in much of the world over the past 2 centuries, which in many respects look back to the French Revolution as the first great modern upheaval in this model, a popular uprising against a centralized, oppressive state, demanding and in many cases bringing about a new social organization with greater freedom and sharing of power. The various European uprisings of 1830, 1848, and 1870 all looked back to the French Revolution for inspiration, and although none of these failed to achieve as complete a restructuring of their society, the Russian Revolution, which closed the century, echoed that in France, not only in many of its dynamics, but in the enormous changes it brought about, both in Russia and around the world. Now, a century later, the revolutionary spirit has moved to the Arab world, and although it is still unclear what the eventual results of this movement will be, one can already see fascinating parallels to these earlier iterations of the revolutionary process. Many parts of this process could be and are being opened for discussion and analysis today. The relationship of theater and performance to the revolutionary spirit is among them. I would like to make a brief exploration of that relationship and suggest how it continues to be repeated in different revolutionary contexts. Many scholars of the French Revolution have stressed its theatricality, citing the great public festivals that were one of its outstanding features, the elaborate allegorical parades, the spectacular public trials and executions, and the general attention to the symbolic display of iconic figures. Even the notorious carrying of heads on pikes may be seen as a grim contribution to this fascination with the symbolic theatricalization of the revolutionary movement. Aside from these important and highly visible evidences of a theatricalized culture, however, I would like to focus more specifically upon three ways in which the theater and revolution have drawn support from each other from late 18th century France into the contemporary Middle East. The first of these, and the most obvious both to participants and to observers, today vastly increased by the media, is the theatricalization of protest itself. However the revolutions of the last 2 centuries have developed, they have generally been launched by a highly theatrical and performative event which served as a symbol of that popular resistance, drew wide attention to the crisis, and eventually became enshrined in the national mythology not only as an initiating action, but as a symbolic grounding of the revolution. The first such event was, of course, the storming of the Bastille in 1789, universally accepted as the beginning of the French Revolution. In terms of actual practical achievement, this famous event, in fact, accomplished very little. The famous prison at that moment held only 7 prisoners, all old men who were apparently annoyed by all the disturbance. Indeed, the building was so costly to run and so little used that the government had already recently decided to close it permanently. Nevertheless, this building, a major landmark since its construction 400 years before, and a state prison for most of its history, gave it an enormous symbolic importance as a symbol of royal authority and power. Louis XVI himself is reported to have said, when forbidding the public performance of Beaumarchais' revolutionary play, The Marriage of Figaro, that before such a play could be presented, the Bastille would have to be destroyed. An ironically prophetic announcement. The siege and subsequent destruction of the Bastille clearly had a strong performative as well as symbolic element, as did the parades, processions, and other celebrations which came immediately in its wake. There's the procession with the heads on the pikes at the bottom. Even the beheading of the governor of the prison and the carrying of his head on a pole through the streets, soon to be followed by other similar displays, were in the nature of a performative or theatrical act, however grisly. The occupation of major symbolic spaces by popular uprisings became, after the fall of the Bastille, the almost always opening act of the revolutions of the next century. Thus, the City Hall of Paris was the first major objective of the revolutionaries of 1830, and again in 1848. In a number of cases, the theater itself became specifically involved with these uprisings. The most famous example occurred in Brussels, Belgium in 1830, soon after the uprisings in Paris. A patriotic opera, Auberge la Muette de Poissy, contained an aria, Sacred Love of the Fatherland, which so inflamed the Belgian audiences they stormed out of the theater and began the revolution that led to Belgian independence 4 months later. In the Paris Revolution of 1848, not only was the Théâtre Historique, founded by the dramatist Alexandre Dumas, at the very center of the uprising, but it was widely observed that the leaders of the barricades erected in that part of Paris were often actors who had trained for battle in the military spectacles in this theater. Each of these uprisings looked back to the First French Revolution for inspiration and performative models. And nowhere is this clearer than in the most important articulation of the European revolutionary model, that in Russia. Although protests and rebellions had grown rapidly throughout the year 1917 in Russia, the event marked by the Bolsheviks as the actual start of the definitive October Revolution was the capture of the royal residence in St. Petersburg, the huge Winter Palace. Although this was subsequently portrayed as a violent occupation, in fact, the almost empty palace was taken without bloodshed by a very small group of rather confused patriots. The Tsar had been deposed 8 months before, and the palace then housed only a few members of the increasingly weak provincial government. Almost immediately, however, this occupation was converted by Bolshevik propaganda into a kind of Russian taking of the Bastille and the initiating event of the Russian Revolution. The second major interaction of this revolutionary tradition with the theater in its culture has been an administrative one. The general pattern of such revolutions, from the originary French one onward, has been the violent uprising of a population against an oppressive minority. Their oppression was inevitably not only political, economic, and social, but aesthetic as well. In the case of the theater, this dynamic has been particularly clear, since almost without exception, beginning with the Revolution of 1789, one of the first acts of each new order has been to do away with censorship, often stronger in the theater than anywhere else, even in journalism. Often, as in revolutionary France, accompanied with the removal of a wide range of other restrictions upon theater as well. Unhappily, in most cases, central control has been reestablished a decade or so later, but the freeing of the drama after a period of repression has nevertheless often inspired major new innovations in the genre. Thus, the French Revolution, though the plays in its wake were often occasional pieces that have not endured, opened the theater in general to new approaches, among them influences from France, from England, and Germany, that made the French stage far more international, opening it to Shakespeare, for example, and also provided an opportunity for popular new experimental pieces like the melodrama to develop. And in their wake, the full flower of French Romanticism, which was able to make its way into the major French stage only after the upheavals of 1830. A third important connection, theater and the revolutionary tradition, is the almost inevitable conversion of revolutionary events back into theatrical reenactments and memorializations. Plays showing the fall of the Bastille were produced by the dozens in French theaters during the decades following that event, and indeed were not confined to France. One of the most famous of the fall of the Bastille spectaculars was The Dead Heart by Watts Phillips, first presented at London's Adelphi Theatre in 1856, and revived as late as 1889 by Henry Irving to celebrate the centenary of the event. By far, the most elaborate and spectacular of the theatrical restaging of revolutionary spectacle was the recreation, or rather the theatricalized reimagining, of the storming of the Winter Palace, directed by Evrainov. Evrainov was commissioned by the Soviet government to recreate this pivotal event on its 3-year anniversary in 1920. This mammoth theatrical production became itself one of the great events of the Russian Revolution. In every respect, the recreation actually was much larger than the original event. It utilized more than 8,000 performers, tanks, cars, and even the battleship Aurora, and attracted over 100,000 spectators. The theatrical events of the great European revolutions from 1789 to 1917 were necessarily experienced, as was the theater itself, by a limited number of spectators, although Evrainov took this number to new dimensions. The world of reception, however, was by the time of Evrainov's staging on the brink of its own revolution. Within 10 years after his storming of the Winter Palace, the first commercial television sets were available in the Soviet Union, as well as in England and the United States. England and France had begun creating films of revolutionary events as early as 1910. But the Russian equivalent, Kino Pravda, was not found until 1922, at which time Moscow still had no theaters for the presentation of such work. Today, the theatricalization of revolution continues, but thanks to film and video, is performed before a world audience, and indeed is now often pursued in part as a way of gaining international rather than purely national attention. The occupation, even the theatricalized conquering of highly public symbolic space, the traditional first phase of the close relationship of performance and revolution, can be clearly seen in the uprisings of the so-called Arab Spring, most notably in the occupation of Tahrir Square. An excellent example of the power of repetition in performance has been the centrality of the Pearl Roundabout in the ongoing resistance movement in Bahrain, a location which clearly draws much of its symbolic power from an ongoing comparison by protesters and the media alike of this rallying point to Egypt's Tahrir Square. With the emergence of modern digital communication, cell phones, Facebook, and the web have created the possibility of a rallying point in cyberspace which can gather and focus resistance and reports on resistance even without the symbolic center of a Bastille or a Winter Palace or a Tahrir Square. There was no real symbolic equivalent of Tahrir Square or the Pearl Roundabout in Libya or Tunisia, but the staging and the performance of revolt was carried out largely through these new media, which provided their own location. Already, we can see the fading of autocratic censorship of theaters in the light of the Arab Spring, although it is still too early to predict what advantages theater artists will make of this increased freedom. It is also still too early to see how the events of the Arab Spring will be reappropriated in local or international performances of exploration or memorialization. But past history makes it clear that revolution and theatrical performance are inextricably intertwined and will continue to shape each other's forms and destinies. Thank you.